In this recording, we'll discuss digestion and absorption that occurs in the small intestine. So your food is composed of lots of different parts. And we've talked previously, carbs, lipids, proteins, etc. Your small intestine is responsible for completing the chemical digestion of all of those foods that we put into our body. So we'll start with fats. These are emulsified by the bile that is produced by the liver ultimately. The emulsification of large fat blobs, which is a very scientific term, blobs, okay? We're going to basically emulsify large fat blobs into small fat droplets or tiny blobs, and we call these micelles, or if you like micelles, that's cool too, okay? So basically you are taking giant fat blobs and you are turning them into small fat blobs that are easier to digest. And I know that all sounds very scientific, but it's true. Now we have pancreatic enzymes and we have brush border enzymes from the small intestine that are going to assist us with hydrolyzing all of the other food groups. So fat just kind of works a little bit different. Okay? In addition to the food groups that we eat, your small intestine also absorbs water and electrolytes. Most of the nutrients that we're going to absorb, including the fats that we just talked about, are absorbed via active transport, which means it requires ATP because we are moving against a concentration gradient. And I think that's kind of interesting to think about. The whole purpose of absorbing the nutrients is so we can use them as energy, but yet it costs us energy to absorb them. So again, I just think that's interesting. These nutrients are going to travel across the mucosal layer into the villi, and then eventually they're going to enter into either the capillaries or the lacteals. Okay? And then they are going to be carried to the liver by both the blood and the lymph. And then the liver is going to do all kinds of fancy stuff with it. When chyme arrives at the large intestine, we've basically taken all the good stuff out. So anything that arrives into the small intestine is pretty well nutrient poor. There are a couple last minute things that the large intestine can kind of absorb from the chyme, but most of the good stuff has been removed by that point. This happens approximately 3 to 6 hours after chyme enters the small intestine. So the process of digestion itself breaks food down into smaller and smaller pieces until we get individual nutrient molecules. Okay, so think of like monomers that we learned about a while ago. There are technically two types of digestion. We've talked about mechanical and chemical digestion previously, but just to refresh, mechanical digestion is more like physical digestion. So think of chewing your food and mixing up food in your stomach and your small intestine. And then chemical digestion is going to involve those enzymes that we've been talking about along and along. So the lipases, the amylases, things like that. All of the nutrients go through the same mechanisms for the mechanical digestion. So everybody does mastication of their foods. They're going to chew their food. Everybody does the churning in the stomach, the segmentation in the small intestine. And then chemical digestion is going to vary based on what types of foods that you have consumed at that particular point. So if you have eaten proteins, then we have to digest those in one way. We're going to need certain protein enzymes. If you've eaten lipids, then we're going to need lipid enzymes instead. We can even get really, really specific and say, oh, well, this nutrient contains single bonds, so we'll use this type of enzyme, but this nutrient contains double bonds, and so we need a different type of enzyme. It gets kind of complicated. We're not going to get that complicated, y'all. Okay, so we briefly talked about lipids having to use the micelles to really get absorbed into the lacteals, but we'll get into a little bit more detail about some of the other types of foods that we consume as well. So for example, carbohydrates. We mentioned way back when we talked about the mouth that carbohydrate digestion starts there with the salivary amylase. You are basically turning large polysaccharides and you're kind of chopping them up a little bit and turning them into oligosaccharides. and oligo means few. Okay, so you take one giant molecule and you break it up into 5 or 10 smaller molecules, but they're still decent size, so we're not done with just that. The digestion is going to continue in the stomach, but after a while the acid basically inactivates the enzymes before we can complete the task, and so eventually we kind of have to push the pause button in the stomach, and we'll pick that up in the small intestine by including pancreatic amylase into the equation. And so the chyme that enters into the duodenum will be mixed with the pancreatic amylase, and we'll take any leftover polysaccharides that weren't properly digested. We'll take the oligosides as well, and we will finally break them down into their smallest component, the monosaccharides. Now, we have enzymes that kind of help us break down the individual components. So like maltose sugar gets broken down by maltase, lactose sugar gets broken down by lactase, and sucrose sugar gets broken down by sucrase. All right, so ACEs are these enzymes that are breaking down these specific sugars that compose polysaccharides. Now, proteins. Okay, so protein digestion doesn't start until we get to the stomach, and we do have certain enzymes within the stomach. We call them collectively as groups, peptidases and proteases, and we have mentioned two specifically. We've mentioned pepsin and renin. Don't forget that good old pepsin comes from pepsinogen, which was created by the chief cells, and remember, to convert the pepsinogen to pepsin we needed that really low pH. Okay. The hydrolysis of the proteins, so to finish the process, we do have to move to the small intestine where we're going to get additional enzymes, for example, trypsin and chymotrypsin, which come from the pancreas, and even more peptidases from the small intestine. Trypsin and chymotrypsin are just really just classic examples, just to put a name with what we're talking about here. But by the time we finish in the small intestine, the proteins will be fully hydrolyzed back into amino acids. All right, lipids. So we briefly talked about lipids a couple slides ago. We're going to go just a little bit more detail. You do have just a tiny bit of lipase. Okay, so remember, ACEs are enzymes. All right, so lipase would be breaking down lipids. Lipid hydrolysis can begin in the mouth as well with small amounts of lipase, but the majority of the chemical digestion of lipids is going to start in the stomach. Okay, we're going to do the churning, okay, to kind of really start to break apart those big fat blobs that we've talked about. And we even have an enzyme. We've got gastric lipase that starts to help us digest the lipids as well. And the process will be finished in the small intestine. We've mentioned emulsification, but just to refresh our memories, emulsification was going to take those big fat blobs. We were going to add bile, specifically bile salts, and further break those down to forms that we can better absorb into our system. We also throw in pancreatic lipase. So we've got all kind of lipases, y'all. Pancreatic lipase is finally going to help us break the fat into the fatty acid tails and the glycerols that we're most familiar with, and these can be absorbed into our lymphatic system. The bile salts themselves remain associated with the digestive lipids. They also help form those micelles that we've talked about. Alright, so just to kind of put everything together, starting with the lipids, we've got the giant fat blob. Okay, in the stomach we do a little bit of churning that breaks them down. We've got a little bit of gastric lipase. We get some diglycerides. We've got a couple free fatty acids, but we're not quite done yet. So we move into the small intestine. These smaller lipids are going to be added to the bile salts. And this is kind of what emulsification looks like. When we talk about emulsification, we're really just trying to make these lipids easier to transport, because lipids are hydrophobic, and because of all the water content and the digestive juices, it makes it a little hard to transport them otherwise. And then we've got the pancreatic lipase coming in and doing a little bit more digestion. So we're getting those free fatty acids, those monoglycerides, and by the time we get to the end, these free fatty acids, these monoglycerides, we can also emulsify those as well. Especially the free fatty acid tails are still quite hydrophobic, and so they're a little difficult to transport otherwise. And so we can make the micelles here, and we can absorb those into those lacteals we've talked about. Alright, so we did lipids. Proteins, we talked about, not really going to start until we get to the stomach. We add things like pepsin. We're chopping up our polypeptide chain. We add the pancreatic enzymes in the small intestine. We're going to keep chopping everybody up until we get to those amino acids. And then carbohydrates start in the mouth. Okay. We've got the salivary amylase breaking our polysaccharide into oligosaccharides. Not a whole lot going on in the stomach. And then we add pancreatic amylase in the small intestine. And we continue to break these down until we get monosaccharides. Just to refresh, here is our digestive enzyme chart. We can't forget about nucleic acids. Those are part of your diet as well. These get digested in the small intestine with the help of some pancreatic enzymes. These are collectively called nucleases. They're not overly exciting, so that's really all we mention about them, but they do get added to the chart way down here at the bottom. We've got our pancreatic juice, including our nucleic acids. We're going to break those down into the nitrogenous bases and the simple sugars that they are composed of. So, again, just our review slide, keeping everything straight. We have mentioned, let me see if there's anything. We mentioned almost every single one of these. Okay. So just kind of collectively keep in the back of your mind, oh, carbohydrates, oh, those were amylases. Proteins, oh, that was the pepsin, the trypsin. Lipids, oh, those were the lipases. Things like that, okay? Now, we also absorb other things like vitamins. Vitamins, so everybody's heard of vitamins, right? Vitamin B, vitamin C, things like that. Vitamins are chemicals that are generally provided by the diet, although some people do take supplements, and that's okay as well. These are involved in all kinds of metabolic reactions within the body, and we can group them into two different categories. We have water-soluble vitamins, and we have fat-soluble vitamins. Your water-soluble vitamins are polar, which is why they can dissolve in water. These are all of the vitamin B's, because there's quite a few vitamin B's. And then we have vitamin C, and there's really only one vitamin C. These are going to be absorbed into the small intestine, most of them. Vitamin B12 specifically, because we have mentioned that a couple of times. If you would like to absorb vitamin B12, which you do want to do that, you must bind it to intrinsic factor. Okay, intrinsic factor, we have talked about intrinsic factor before. If you don't remember where it comes from, flip back in your notes. But ultimately, we are going to absorb the B12 into your good old ileum. Okay. Now, your fat-soluble vitamins, these are lipid-based. These are nonpolar, which is why they are not soluble in water. They are soluble in fat instead. These are A, D, E, and K vitamins. The fat-soluble vitamins have to be packaged into the micelles along with other fats from the diet, and then everybody can be absorbed into those lacteals. Now, electrolytes. We're also going to absorb electrolytes. These are things that you're already familiar with: sodiums, potassiums, calciums, things like that. Most of your electrolytes are absorbed into the small intestine, regardless of whether or not you need them, because they're kind of a big deal, right? Think about how many times we've talked about sodium and potassium and calcium. We're really just not wanting to run the risk of ever running out of any of those, or even just running low on any of those. Calcium and iron specifically are absorbed into your duodenum if the body needs them. Okay. Calcium, we can't have too much calcium in the body because we do store so much in the bones. We don't necessarily always need to absorb every last calcium molecule in the small intestine. Iron, that is technically a metal, okay, a heavy metal, and any kind of heavy metal in the body can cause problems if we have too much of it. So we're a little bit selective about that as well. Calcium absorption is also regulated by parathyroid hormone, as well as the presence of vitamin D. All right, so we've mentioned those two quite a few times with regards to calcium, so hopefully you remember the link between those. Now, sodium absorption is coupled with the active transport of glucose and amino acids. So because we're coupling things, we call this co-transport. Okay. Sodium is actively pumped out of the cell as well via the sodium-potassium pumps. Okay. So we can move sodium in a couple of different ways. Okay. And then potassium is passively absorbed through facilitated diffusion because of the changing osmotic pressures that we can experience. Anything that interferes with water absorption also reduces potassium absorption and can pull more potassium from your interstitial space. Okay. Eventually we will talk about what happens if you have too much or too little calcium, sodium, and potassium. All right, so it is important that we regulate the absorption of these ions and these electrolytes to a degree. And then we have water. On average, about 9 liters of water enter your small intestine every single day. Okay, and we get this water from a lot of different places. About 2 liters of water are just ingested. Okay, and that's not just necessarily you drinking like 2 liters of water a day. It comes from your food as well. The other 7 liters, however, are coming from the secretions of your alimentary canal and your accessory organs. So your body makes water, which is kind of cool. Of those 9 liters, about 8 are absorbed into the small intestine. Good old osmosis is responsible for 300 to 400 milliliters per hour. And then water can also be coupled with solute uptake like sodiums and glucoses, amino acids, things like that as well. The other liter, okay, so we got about 1 liter left, right? 8 get reabsorbed in the small intestine. The remaining water is absorbed by the large intestine, okay? And we do almost all of that last liter, about 1/10 of a liter, so about 100 milliliters of water is excreted in feces. Okay, so we put 9 liters in, and we reabsorbed all but about 100 mils, which is excreted in feces. So that's pretty good.